Hello. Welcome to Intercultural Communication. We're going to go over the last part of chapter 2. I decided to do this in Zoom because it is 30 slides long and they're pretty complex. So I'm just going to go ahead and share screen, and you all will hopefully hear in a second, see my screen, and I'm going to then do some slideshow and play from the beginning. Okay, so this is the second part of chapter 2 where we talk about the three types of globalization from the text. And this is pretty dense stuff. It was a little bit outside of my, background, having not had a lot of deep, international economics classes. So I'm hoping that you all were able to follow along and appreciate the importance of what the significance globalization has on intercultural communication all around the world. So I chose this picture. This is actually a picture of air flights, but I felt like it's sort of like a heat map, right? And it shows where people are going and coming from around the world, and in some ways represents our interaction, right? Both communication and through transportation, how much we're able to interact around the world. So, what we're going to cover today is we're going to talk about. I'm doing a quick introduction. We're going to do a little review from the last part of chapter 2, and then we're just going to jump right into economic globalization, political globalization, and cultural globalization, and what each of those three types of globalization means. So, to review, right, we live in an increasingly dynamic and mobile world. We have growing global interdependence, meaning we're all, more reliant on one another than we ever have been before. Um, Through this interdependence and constant, and increasing contact, we have magnified inequities. And again, remember from the first part of the chapter, we talked about the historical legacy of colonization and how that has played a role in almost every possible intercultural interaction you could have to this day. Face-to-face interactions are less common, but still very important. And as we start to interact with people more and more, we're more likely to need to have intercultural communication skills. And then all of what goes into globalization is complex. And the three sort of factors that we are going to focus on for the rest of this lecture and the rest of chapter 2 involve economic, political, and cultural aspects of what makes up globalization. So let's get into it. So let's start with economic globalization. Um, Currently, the United States has an agreement with Mexico and Canada that's called the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement. It used to be called NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. And in Trump's second term, just in the last few months, he's actually even gone against USMCA. So NAFTA and USMCA were really all about free trade and trying to make it easier for U.S. Americans to purchase items that were manufactured in other countries. This would allow, of course, for us to keep our costs low and also outsource a lot of those jobs that U.S. Americans didn't want to have. One of the reasons that Trump is saying that he has imposed tariffs in the last 3 or 4 months is because he was sort of addressing the fact that we are losing jobs in the United States and more people are having trouble making ends meet. And so the vision, right, was that if you impose tariffs on out of country products, then people will be driven to buy products that are made in the US, which will, supposedly create more manufacturing jobs. The problem is that that ship has sailed, right? And that US Americans who are middle class do not, aspire to have their children grow up to go work in a factory, sewing Nike tennis shoes or making iPhones. So it's just because there are tariffs now, or he paused those, but he imposed them for a bit. That didn't necessarily, it would take 30 years to recreate the manufacturing infrastructure we used to have. So, the next thing to talk about under economic globalization is language. And languages are truly repositories for culture, right? So they're complex, they're nuanced, they both reflect our culture and also help construct our culture. Languages, not verbal and nonverbal, convey meanings about the values, beliefs, and assumptions of a culture. And translation across cultures can lead to confusion. I have some pictures here of some translated, ideas that didn't quite make they didn't hit the mark as far as actually being true translations. For example, the top one is like, anyone obeying the swimming pool regulations may be required to leave. That doesn't make sense, right? Probably it was supposed to be disobeying the swimming pool regulations, or do not sit in chairs unless using them for their intended use. Isn't sitting in chairs their intended use? So something lost in translation, right? Translation across cultures can lead to confusion, misunderstanding, and communication failures if culture is not understood. The confluence and interplay of languages in the global context also leads to hybrid forms. Here, in New Mexico, we talk about Spanglish a lot, where we will use Spanish pronunciation for certain words and then English pronunciation for other ones, or within the same sentence, you might have both Spanish and English words, regardless of if, you were raised speaking Spanish. That obviously happens a lot more if you are truly bilingual, but even Anglo, English only speaking Albuquerque, residents or Burqueños, right, use Spanglish. And the same thing goes for Konglish, which is the same idea with Korean and English. When you use hybrid forms like this, it challenges shared systems of meanings within those cultures. So not only is it a blending of the language, but it's actually a blending of the culture. In intercultural mistakes can be really costly. They can destroy relationships. They can lead to misunderstanding. They can, cost you money if you're trying to do business with somebody from another culture. So it's critical to be aware of the fact that, languages do not just directly, translate. Researcher and marketing expert in Sejong University in South Korea, Yongshik, criticizes the use of Konglish in corporate slogans, arguing that it damages the image of Korean companies because of the reputation of the United States and also, again, that misunderstanding of the different cultures. So let's talk a little bit about free trade agreements again, back to the NAFTA and USMCA. Free trade agreements. The United States and other first world nations promoted and supported free trade agreements, which liberalized trade by reducing trade tariffs and barriers transnationally, while maintaining protection for some of their own businesses, but not all of them, right? Just the ones that they felt that they had a sort of a corner on the market. Until the last 35 to 45 years, that wasn't the foreign policy, right? The United States opposed free trade policies in an effort to protect US jobs, products, and services. And so, again, that's the rhetoric that Trump is using, is that he wants to go back to 35 or 45 years ago where we were protecting US jobs, products, and services. However, we've seen that it's leading to a recession and is limiting our ability to get resources. Thus, his comment about, make sure that, just tell your children instead of getting $20, they're going to get $2 for Christmas. So that's him starting to advise US Americans that we're going to have to change our consumption lifestyle, right? Like it's not going to be the same as it has been for the last 35 to 45 years, because we've hit the maximum capacity and we're not able to make that our prosperity was dependent on being able to constantly go and exploit more and more outside spaces to be able to produce products cheaply, and we've hit saturation on that. In the last few months, the US has imposed tariffs on foreign imports under the guise of driving business to domestic producers. And like I said earlier, that ship has largely sailed. Instituting tariffs won't bring back those manufacturing jobs. The one advice that the author gives us in this situation is, in order for us to maintain a middle class in the US, we need to shift. It's time we shift our skills. so that we have the skills that are meeting the needs of, U.S. Americans. And it's also time to shift our expectations. Trump's not wrong in the sense that we need to start limiting what we give our children for, gifts, and how we spend and how many, clothes we wear and how often we get our hair cut. We're going to have to reduce our spending and expectations. The concept of neoliberalism is an economic and political theory promoting free trade, privatization of natural resources. So, making sure that those are not publicly held entities. Again, you can see this in Trump's move to take over some of the national parks, and then also privatization of institutions, right? Having education go from public to charter to private, having care go from it's a public good that is provided by the government to privatizing prisons, military, think of all of the subcontractors that were doing military and security services. Those are all institutions that are being, privatized under neoliberalism. Reliance on individual and minimal government intervention or support for social services is part of neoliberalism. And it's important to note this last point here. Neoliberal policies and people who identify as liberal are usually on the opposite ends of ideological spectrums. So those are not the same concept. Somebody who is a neoliberal or neoliberalism is actually more likely to vote Republican and be self-identify as conservative than somebody who is progressive, liberal, and wants to have more social services that are publicly funded. So some other things and aspects of economic globalization. Production has moved offshore, right? Again, like I said, your tennis shoes, your iPhone, your computer, many things are being produced outside of the US. So as a result of neoliberalism, economic liberalization or free trade, advances in transportation and communication technologies, manufacturing sectors have moved offshore or outside the geographic boundaries of the corporate ownership's country of origin. So if, let's say craft food started in the United States, they no longer are likely producing that food within the United States. It's likely being produced in Mexico, in India, in some other place around the world. And even though they started here, they may not even have their headquarters in the United States anymore. In search of cheaper labor, labor and environmental regulations, so less costly regulations as far as labor, as far as environmental, consequence, and tax breaks, US-based national and multinational corporations, as well as corporations based in other first world nations, such as Europe, Australia, Canada, and Japan, have relocated sites of production to what used to be second and third world countries, right? Mexico, Central America, China, and countries in Asia such as Vietnam, Singapore, and the Philippines. Corporations in search of ways to expand their markets turn to populations in other countries. As a result, most all business transactions today have an intercultural component. So if you want to go into business, specifically at the industrial or the larger system level, you are likely going to have an intercultural, interaction. The maquiladoras, those were established in 1964. It was sort of an agreement between US, European, and Japanese corporations to establish production centers in Mexico. The system is touted as a trade policy, not as, or as a trade policy, but a solution to a geopolitical challenge, providing employment, economic growth, and security on both sides of the border, right? So it was touted as a win-win. It was helping take people who were in poverty and giving them jobs in Mexico, where the cost of living was much lower. And it was also a way to reduce costs so that US Americans could continue to consume at the same rate. However, or even more, millions of Mexican factory workers to this day remain in the lower class. It did not prove to be a way, for upward mobility for factory workers in Mexico. There's a picture here that I just pulled from a newspaper, I want to say in the last 6 months or so. And it says that employees who work in a maquiladora on the production line in Ciudad Acuna in Mexico typically make about $7.50 a day, US dollars. So this is why, even though they're working regularly, they're not necessarily making enough money to move from poverty into the middle class. Free trade and economic global liberalization. Again, here's the picture of the three countries in, North America, and a reminder: the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, transition into the USMCA. Free trade created lower price for consumer goods and made money for multinational corporations, right? Um, Global financial institutions and popular resistance. So, again, part of this book talks about, for as much as intercultural communication is about capitalism and globalization and business, it's also a point at which people are organizing interculturally and around the world internationally. So, movements and protests against the World Trade Organization, starting back in the late 90s and going through the 2000s, there was the Occupy Wall Street movement and what's called the Alter Globalization or the Global Justice Movement. Union organizers raised concern about competition from cheaper labor abroad. Concerns about working conditions in other countries started to gain traction. Environmentalists were deeply disturbed by the unregulated outsourcing of pollution. Global financial institutions, including GATT, which became the WTO, IMF, and the WB, are the primary institutions on the macro level governing economic globalization. The increased intercultural business transactions came from this, integration of global markets, and impacts on consumer prices, job opportunities, and the future of our planet. Brexit is an example of political globalization. So now we're moving away from economic and into political. The withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union exemplifies the rejection of globalizing and integrating forces. The mistrust of the ruling class, right? We're seeing that here in the United States, obviously, as well, and a desire to return to the sovereignty of the nation state. So, in the United Kingdom, there's a push to try to get back to the days of old when they were an imperialist country and there were much more resources available. Xenophobia is the fear of outsiders. So this is triggered in times when we're starting to have to restrict, and we're seeing that stretch between the rich and the poor with less middle class happening. And it results in xenophobia. As again, we have seen across our country, we see daily, just yesterday, I believe there were actually over the weekend, there were massive protests in Los Angeles about ICE raids, which is the capitalization on that fear of the outsider. Trends towards democratization. In the early decades of globalization, there were trends towards democratization, or at least market driven democratization, right? We certainly said that we promoted democracies around the world, but what we really meant was specifically consuming in a free trade environment. It wasn't always about democratization of the governing structure. This is closely linked to free trade agreements and the agendas again of the WTO, the WB, and the IMF. More on all three of those institutions, by the way, in your book. So please do, not watch just the video, but also go back and hopefully read the book first and watch the video as a review, but also go back, circle, and highlight and make sure you understand before you take your quiz. So ethno-nationalism, authoritarianism, and militarism is a byproduct of political globalization. So again, democratization refers to the transition from an authoritarian to a democratic political system that ensures the universal right to vote. A correlation between free market capitalism and democratic governance exists, yet research and experience also provide ample evidence that the two are in conflict with one another. So while it's been, believed that free trade and democracies go hand in hand, it turns out that that's not how it's playing out. True free market capitalism inevitably results in inequitable distribution of wealth and resources. Again, It's called end stage capitalism, and where instead of everyone having an ability to, work hard and achieve their goals and, pull themselves up by their bootstraps, the ultra rich get richer, which creates even more people in poverty. No matter how hard they work, they can't get out of that. Economic inequalities or inequities. A decade after the Occupy Wall Street movement, the central message of economic inequities between the very wealthy and the rest has gained traction, animating progressive politicians, right? You can see an old Occupy Wall Street sign here. We are the 99%. 1% has most of the money, 99% has not nearly as much as what the 1% has. In context of neoliberal globalization, conservative right-wing politicians have also mobilized the anger, discontent, and resentment regarding economic inequity, targeting immigrants and people of color for the failures of globalization. And we're going to find that that's not the source, and it's a futile effort to think that if you can get rid of immigrants or you can, take away access and resources from people of color, that will, in fact, solve the problem of end stage capitalism. So, oftentimes, and one of the things, the concepts that was brought up in the book is this concept of a dog whistle, which is how you can motivate. I think my dog just heard me say dog. Um, hey, hold on just a second. Okay, continuing right along. So, the dog whistle is a coded message communicating particular meanings to certain groups that can also be defended as legitimate to others, right? It's a way of saying something where you can sort of gaslight the rest of the population and say, "Oh, I wasn't meaning that," but you can trigger those fears, and usually they have to do with race, but they can really have to do with anything. So, dog whistles literally produce a high frequency sound that can only be heard by dogs and not humans. So, this idea that you can, make a noise that only certain populations hear is what the notion of dog whistle means. When used metaphorically in a political context, statements like "Make America Great Again" are dog whistles heard by disaffected white Americans as signs of support and approval for white nationalism. Ethno-nationalism is nationalism based on ethnicity, a form of nationalism based specifically on ethnicity. Defining characteristics of a nation state is understood as shared ethnic heritage, bloodline, or race, language, religion, or ancestry. Adherents to white nationalism believe white identity should be the unifying principle of Western countries and seek to reverse demographic changes um, as a way to preserve a white majority. A wave of ethno-nationalism has currently inundated many parts of the world in diverse areas, array of countries, including Turkey, India, Brazil, and Myanmar. It's the age of anger. Authoritarian leaders manipulate cynicism and discontent of furious majorities. I'm going to go ahead and stop share. Okay, sorry, we should be back. I think that I was no longer sharing, so I wanted to make sure you saw the political globalization slide, talking about ethno-nationalism and the age of anger. So the French word ressentiment, translated in English to resentment, is a complex and layered emotion of intense envy, humiliation, and powerlessness, where hostility is directed at individuals or groups seen as the cause of one's frustration and anger. The resentment has grown in proportion to the spread of liberal democratic principles of equality and individualism and has become particularly pronounced today because of deepening contradictions. Authoritarian leaders across the globe arouse and harness populist anger, discontent, and resentment to advance ethno-nationalist movements predicated on anti-immigrant, anti-democratic rhetoric, practices, and policies. And we see that playing out literally as we speak right now. marked by hateful and dehumanizing and violent rhetoric and policies that scapegoat immigrants, women, people of color, as well as religious and sexual minorities. Obviously, they're also scapegoating gender minorities, trans folks as well. Milita- Militarization refers to the process of a society organizing itself for military conflict and use of violence. In earlier decades, the buildup on the US Mexican border was framed as part of the war on drugs, then the war on crime, and more recently, the war on terror. It's now going back to being more war on crime, less about war on terror from, feared Islamic migrants, but that's an undercurrent that exists as well. The militarization of the border, similar to the militarization of the police in the United States and around the world, advances militaristic rhetoric, policies, practices, tactics, and equipment to address social issues, which normalizes a culture of violence, erosion of civil liberties, and the violation of human rights. Authoritarian forms of government, increased economic inequity resulting from neoliberal globalization has created a political arena where those most disadvantaged economically are now targeted as the problem or the cause of discontent, where the specter of the other has long been used to incite anxiety and fear and hatred. The conditions are particularly ripe right now to edge democracies towards more authoritarian forms of governance in subtle and more blatant ways, right? So it's not unlikely that we have a more authoritarian president than we have ever had, and it's also not unlikely that won't continue down that path. Militarization of the border, similar to militarization of the police in the United States and around the world, advances. We've seen militarization of schools, we've seen militarization of lots of settings. These are some pictures I pulled from this spring of the militarization of the New Mexico border. On the left here, we have a soldier in a striker vehicle who's looking across the border from the top of a mesa near Sunland Park border. And this is in Santa Teresa, New Mexico. And then over on the right, they were doing a big sort of press conference. And these are some Army soldiers awaiting the Department of Defense Secretary in February, also in New Mexico. Political globalization usually predicates on ideological wars. So historically, we had the Cold War. So what is an ideology? An ideology is a set of ideas or beliefs reflecting the needs and aspirations of individuals, groups, classes, or cultures that form the basis for political, economic, and other systems. So you believe that, everyone having a right to vote is an ideology. Believing that, the populace should not be, part of the decision-making process is an ideology. Dominant ideologies include beliefs about gender, race, class, religion, and nation, as well as the economy, politics, and the environment. Ideological wars are when you have conflicts between differing belief systems. And I pulled an old sort of, I would say poster slash comic that was used during the Cold War. And, basically it's depicting the doom and gloom that would occur if the United States were to slip into communism. The Cold War, it was a struggle between capitalism and democracy over and or against communism and totalitarianism. More recently, an ideological war that you might be familiar with was the war on terror, right? And so post 9/11, US leaders, mostly President Bush, framed the war on terror as a global fight for freedom, employing us versus them rhetoric that evoked historical conflicts like the Crusades, to portray a clash between Western and Islamic civilizations. The war on terror was used to advance major increases in US military spending, the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, the invasion or the covert operations in Yemen and other countries in the Middle East, the detention of accused enemy combatants without trial to Guantanamo Bay, the incursion of civil liberties through the US Patriot Act, right? Not even being able to fly without having, a full body scan, the development of new security institutions such as the Department of Homeland Security, and wide-ranging surveillance and intelligence gathering powers of the National Security Administration. Liberal democracy refers to a form of governance that values individual rights and human rights, the rule of law, free and fair elections, checks and balances in the government, and civilian control over the military. Global democratic freedoms are on the decline, while autocratic capitalism in countries such as China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia are on the rise. Employ false dichotomies. So, in order to make these ideological wars work, ideological battles use this false dichotomy. It's us versus them. It's black versus white. It requires adherence to a belief in freedom versus adherence to Islam or immigrant rights versus national unity. Oh, it says, sorry about that. A belief in freedom versus adherence to Islam, right? Those are supposed to be ideological opposites. Or immigrant rights versus national unity, galvanizing the public while obscuring the complexities and nuances of other intercultural issues. So, questions of governance on global, national, state, and local levels. Who is at the table, literally and figuratively? I sent a letter to the editor actually just yesterday at the Albuquerque Journal regarding their coverage of the ICE raids down in at the border in a dairy farm. They interviewed the dairy owner. They interviewed two law enforcement representatives using a quote from one of their press releases, and they had a quote from the governor. They did not talk to anyone who was deported. They did not talk to anyone who was a family member of somebody who was deported. They did not talk to any of the other employees at the facility. So literally, whose voice was heard in that conversation? Who was at the table? When decisions that affect people close by and in the far reaches of the world are made, whose voices are represented and whose interests are served? What standpoints and positionalities are silenced or dismissed when there's a disagreement? Who's being listened to? Whose language, ideologies, political processes, and economic systems dominate? And whose rules, behaviors, communication styles, values, and beliefs are privileged and normalized? So, those are questions of governance that are relevant to political globalization. G7 and G20 countries. So the G7 or Group of Seven is an annual meeting of international leaders composed of the US, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Canada, Italy, and Japan, mainly used to address global political issues. The G20 is the G7 plus both advancing and emerging economies, including Australia, Argentina, Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, South Korea, and Turkey. Representation regarding global political issues is still very limited and exclusive, and for smaller nations with over a third of the world's population, they still aren't at the table. Representation is absent. If they're not listed in the G20, they're not in the room. The global justice movement is a loosely connected network of social organizations and actors engaging in collective action to advance social, economic, political, and environmental justice among people around the globe. So again, using intercultural communication for a point of coming together to work together in order to advocate for, less pollution, better labor practices, and just a global approach to our interactions, our political, our economic, and our cultural, way of being. In 2019, the Green New Deal was proposed. It didn't make it as far as it would have liked, but it certainly started to make some differences and was introduced at the state level. And the premise here was a congressional resolution that aimed to address the crisis of inequality and climate change, including reductions in the nation's dependence on fossil fuels, curb greenhouse gas emissions, guaranteed a living wage job to those in clean energy industries. Across the country, local coalitions of environmental, labor, consumer, and immigrant rights groups support Green New Deal policies that reduce pollution, address economic inequities, and social injustices. The Sunrise Movement was a specific aspect of the Green New Deal. Here are some pictures. These actually ran at the end of 2024, right before President Trump took office. And these are some young people that were heavily involved in the Green New Deal and climate change advocacy internationally. So the goals of again, we're looking here at the Sunrise Movement, were the land protected as national monuments. Those were protected. Permits denied for liquid natural gas projects. funds allocated for the Inflation Reduction Act. Dakota Access Pipeline was shut down for good, or to be shut down for good. Focus on state politics, so getting people into office that are supportive of environmental policies that are pro-environment, reducing the use of fossil fuels at a local level, and re-energizing the country to elect climate-conscious leaders. So now let's transition into cultural globalization. Essentially, cultural globalization has to do with migration and cultural connectivities. So it talks and speaks to the fact that our world is in motion, right? Culture has been deterritorialized, which means that your culture is no longer dependent on you living in a certain area or region. You take your culture with you as you move around the world. Cultural subjects are people, and cultural objects, film, food, traditions, ideas, are uprooted from their situatedness in a particular physical geographic location. And then they are re-territorialized and relocated in new, multiple, and varied geographic spaces. Migration and cultural connectivities, places that are considered as home. In previous times, when people moved voluntarily or forcibly to distant locations, they likely stayed in that new location, right? They moved once and then they put down roots, and that became their new home. While they may have had intermittent contact with their original home, they were unlikely to visit frequently or maintain regular communication as is possible today through the internet. So I'm thinking about like the immigrant wave from Italy that settled in Albuquerque, right? That the if you talk to descendants of those communities that came here in the early 20th century, early 1900s, right? They would say maybe they made one trek back to Italy with the whole family, but once in their entire life after they moved here. Today, due to advances in communication and transportation technology, we see the emergence of global circuits of cultural connection, community interconnection between multiple geographic locations crossing national and continental boundaries. So people, even if they immigrate, they're communicating regularly every day with people back at home. Migrants today are likely to consider several places in the world as home. Remittances are literally when you send money home to the country of origin. So even though you have moved to a new place, you are still connected monetarily and invested in your original home. Here's a graphic of the top remittance recipients. India is getting the vast majority of remittance from around the world. Mexico after that, then China, Philippines, Pakistan, Egypt, Bangladesh, as you can read there. Diasporic communities are groups of people who leave their homeland and who maintain a longing to return home, such as the expulsion and dispersion of Jews during the Babylonian exile of 700 BCE, right? There's this cultural, lineage and history and storytelling and education that literally still talks about that exile and how they still want to go back to the promised land, to the original homeland. The African diaspora that forcibly uprooted and transplanted Africans to the Americas and the Caribbean during the period of the British colonization. There's still this displacement and sense of not having a home, right? And being interested in knowing about the original culture. The Armenian diaspora is another example. There was a genocide in Turkey in the 20th century that resulted in approximately 1.5 million Armenians dying and being murdered. And so their family, their children, their ancestors moved to the United States. They moved to Latin America. They moved all around the world. In the United States, the two largest Armenian enclaves are in Worcester, Massachusetts, and in Fresno area and into Glendale down in Southern California of California. Cultural imperialism is when the domination of one culture over others through cultural forms, such as popular culture, media, and cultural products. So think about how large Bollywood is in India and all of the actors and, movies that come out of that. And yet the American Hollywood productions, though smaller in number, are still the dominant cultural representations of entertainment in that media form. right? Americanization is the economic globalization has exacerbated an inequitable spread of US-based corporations and cultural products, right? When you go around the world, you can see McDonald's and Starbucks in almost every aspect of the entire world, but you do not see Italian companies or Mexican companies or Chinese companies in every other space at the same rate. While providing additional goods and services, this has also led to bankruptcy of local industries and has had a dramatic impact on local cultural values, traditions, norms, and practices. It's also important to think about the Chinese correct political orientation concept. The underlying beliefs and behavioral norms of individualism and democracy are seen as threats to the cultural values of collectivism and the political goals of communism. So, fearing the loss of ideological stronghold on youth, the one the not the current, but I believe the previous Chinese president ordered Chinese universities to adhere to the correct political orientation to counter what is viewed as cultural threats from popular culture and an infiltration of Western values. Chinese youth across have access, though, to U.S. television programs, movies, and sports, and that still promotes independence, autonomy, and individual identities, as well as mistrust and challenge to authority. Here's an example, just a picture I pulled from the internet of the Americanization of China, right? This was when the Barbie movie was coming out, and you can see that again, they're consuming entertainment made in the United States about Americans, about American cultural values, autonomy, and it's happening all around the world. So, struggles to survive for non-American cultures. An overwhelming dominance of US cultural products, cultural industries, and culturally produced identities exists in the world market today. The result is an ongoing daily contestation among local and national cultural industries, products, and identities. The unequal diffusion of Western, specifically US cultural products, identities, and ideologies and control of mass media can be seen as a form of cultural imperialism. While, we're no longer physically colonizing other, nation states, although there's still an argument to be made that we may still have colonies if you consider the protectorates of Guam and Puerto Rico as colonies of the US. But we're no longer sort of continuing to grow in cultural, colonization. However, from a cultural perspective, we are absolutely still promoting American culture. Cultures outside the center of power are saturated through market-driven globalization by American cultural ideals and becoming increasingly Americanized and homogenized by and assimilated to American culture. Domination of Western cultural forms. Cultural imperialism today can be understood as the domination of Western cultural forms, norms, practices, and beliefs. And those include the ideologies of individualism, Western style democracy, Western notions of freedom and human rights. There's probably others. Cultural globalization also results in hybrid cultural forms. So those are when you mix cultures together, right, and produce new and distinct, whether it's music or uh, fashion or food, right? Think fusion. So this idea that once you combine them, there's a whole new thing that's produced that isn't really either of the first two, challenging the idea that there is only a unilateral dissemination of culture and cultural forms from the United States and Western cultures because we're seeing these hybrids, right? Reggaeton is an example of a blend of rap and reggae with Latin influence and origins, which soared in popularity in the mid 2000s. A type of resistance that non-dominant groups are employing out of fear of total assimilation. So it's sort of like a harm reduction, and it's a mean of cultural maintenance in the midst of powerful dominant cultural forces. So, in conclusion, we talked a little bit about power. The media landscape is playing a role in, which cultures are being adopted and seen as the dominant in the main and being normalized. We also talked a little bit about international climate crisis and how that's a point of international, interaction, but also a point of opportunity for collaboration. And then specifically, we went into economic globalization, talking about global business, global markets, free trade, political globalization, ethno-nationalism, authoritarianism, and militarism, and the global justice movements. And then finally, we talked about cultural globalization, so the deterritorialized and reterritorialized peoples who have been uprooted from where they were born, and then moved into a new place. Cultural flows, how culture is going back and forth, and that people are not necessarily fully moving without still communicating to their home origin. Diasporas are when people are having to move around the world because of violence. Cultural connectivities, again, are this ability for us to communicate and travel. The Americanization of the rest of the world through things like Starbucks and products and consumption. And then finally, we talked a little bit about hybrid cultures as sort of like a strategy to maintain some of the existing culture. And sometimes those hybrid cultures are so unique that they really don't resemble either of the two original cultures and spaces. That was a long and a little bit dense, half chapter, but I'm excited if you made it to the end of this, and I hope you appreciate how relevant it is to what's going on right now in New Mexico, around the country, and around the world. I look forward to jumping into chapter 3 next. Bye.